The smell of motor oil and old leather had always comforted her, until the day it started to smell like failure. She stood in the doorway of the garage, her pristine white Louboutins hovering inches above the grease-stained concrete, looking at her husband as if he were a stain she couldn't quite scrub out. He wiped his hands on a rag, not realizing that while he was fixing a transmission, she was already shifting gears into a life that didn't include him. If you want to witness the brutal collision between a man who builds with his hands and a woman who destroys with her ambition, stay here, because the wreckage is just beginning. The fluorescent lights of the kitchen buzzed with a low, irritating hum, a sound James had never noticed until tonight. Or maybe it was just that tonight, every sound felt like a warning. James sat at the small Formica table, his hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee. His hands were scrubbed raw, the skin red and chapped, but faint dark lines of grease still traced the whorls of his fingerprints. No matter how much pumice soap he used, the shop always came home with him. Isabella hated that. "Are you listening to me, James?" He looked up. Isabella was standing by the refrigerator, looking out of place in their cramped queen's kitchen. She was wearing the black silk dress she had bought last week, the one that cost more than his shop's rent for the month. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. She looked like a sculpture. Cold, beautiful, distant. "I'm listening," James said, his voice raspy from a day spent shouting over impact wrenches and roaring engines. "You said you're evolving. It's not just a word, James. It's a reality." She gestured around the room, her manicured nails sweeping over the peeling wallpaper and the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. "Look at this. Look at us. We've been running in place for 10 years. You're happy fixing other people's junk, staying in this neighborhood, eating at the same diner every Friday. I can't do it anymore. I feel like I'm dying by inches." "It's an honest life, Bella," James said quietly. "We built this. I put you through school with this junk." Isabella flinched, but her expression hardened instantly. "And I'm grateful. I really am. But gratitude isn't a marriage. I need stimulation. I need to be around people who challenge me, who understand the world I'm working in. The gallery, the artists, the conversations, it's a different language. And you don't speak it." She didn't say the name, but James knew it. Matthew. He was the one who spoke the language. The artist with the trust fund who had been mentoring Isabella for the past 6 months. James had seen the texts pop up on her phone late at night. Messages about lighting, texture, and soul connections. "Does he speak it better?" James asked, his eyes locking onto hers. Isabella paused, her hand hovering over the handle of her designer suitcase. "This isn't about Matthew. This is about me. About my potential." "Right," James said, a bitter smile touching his lips. "It's about potential." He stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. Isabella took a half step back, as if she expected him to yell, to throw something, to be the rough, unrefined mechanic she had convinced herself he was. But James didn't yell. He walked over to the hook by the door where his work keys hung, the keys to the shop, the tow truck, the safe. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single silver key, the key to the apartment. He placed it on the table. "You don't have to explain the art, Bella," James said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I might just be a mechanic, but I know when a part is broken beyond repair. You don't replace the engine when the car is already totaled. You just walk away." Isabella stared at him, confused by his lack of fight. She wanted a scene. She wanted him to beg, so she could feel justified in leaving him. His dignity was an inconvenience. "I'm leaving the car," she said, her voice wavering slightly for the first time. "You can keep the Honda. I won't need it in the city. Matthew, I'll be taking cabs." "Take whatever you want," James said, turning his back to her to wash his mug in the sink. "Just don't expect the garage door to be open when you decide the city is too cold." "I won't come back," she snapped, her arrogance returning like a shield. "I'm finally going to where I belong." The sound of her heels clicking on the floor was sharp and rhythmic, like a ticking clock counting down the seconds. The door opened. The sounds of the Queen's Street, sirens, shouting, the rumble of the subway, flooded the quiet apartment. "Goodbye, James," she said. He didn't turn around. "Goodbye, Isabella." The door slammed. The lock clicked. James stood at the sink for a long time, the water running over his hands. He looked down at the grease stains still embedded in his skin. For years, he had tried to scrub them away to be clean enough for her. He turned off the faucet. The silence in the apartment was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It felt clean. He dried his hands on a rough towel. Tomorrow, he had a '67 Mustang coming in with a blown gasket. It would be a hell of a job. It would take all his focus, all his strength, and all his time. And for the first time in years, he looked forward to getting his hands dirty. The morning light in Soho was different from the light in Queens. In Queens, the sun fought its way through the blinds, usually accompanied by the rumble of the 7 train and the smell of roasting coffee from the bodega downstairs. Here, in Matthew's penthouse, the light poured in unobstructed through 12-foot floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the polished concrete floors in a harsh, clinical white glow. Isabella stood in the center of the living room, holding her coffee cup with both hands. It was an artisanal ceramic mug, handleless, the kind that looked beautiful on Instagram but burned your fingers if you held it too long. She shifted her weight, careful not to disturb the layout of the room. Everything here had a place. The Vasily chair was angled just so. The stack of oversized art books on the low table was arranged by color, not subject. It felt less like a home and more like a gallery exhibit where she was the newest installation. "Don't stand there, Bella. You're blocking the shadow play." Matthew's voice drifted from the corner where he had set up an easel. He didn't look up. He was mixing paints with a frantic, rhythmic motion, his silk robe hanging loosely off one shoulder. Isabella moved quickly, stepping out of the patch of sunlight. "Sorry, I was just taking it all in. It's quiet up here." "Silence is the canvas for thought," Matthew muttered, applying a slash of crimson to the canvas. "By the way, the espresso machine. You left the steam wand dirty. The milk crusts over if you don't wipe it immediately. It ruins the aesthetic." "I didn't know," Isabella said, a flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. She was the manager of a prestigious gallery. She curated million-dollar exhibitions. Yet, standing here in her silk pajamas, being scolded about a coffee machine, she felt like a clumsy intern. "I'll clean it." "Leave it. The maid comes at 10, Matthew said, finally turning to look at her. He smiled, that dazzling, boyish smile that had charmed her at the fundraiser 6 months ago. "Come here. Let me look at you." She walked over, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. Matthew reached out, his thumbs smeared with red paint, and traced the line of her jaw. He didn't ask how she slept. He didn't ask if she missed her home. He looked at her face as if checking the lighting. "Perfect," he whispered. "Tragic and hopeful. That's the look. Go put on the black dress. We have brunch with the curator from the MoMA at noon. You need to look expensive." Isabella nodded, forcing a smile. This was what she wanted, wasn't it? The access. The elite circle. She walked toward the bedroom, passing the floor-to-ceiling window again. She looked down at the street, 5 stories below. The people looked like ants. She felt a sudden wave of vertigo, a terrifying sense of being unmoored. Miles away, across the East River, James was awake. He hadn't slept. The bed in the Queen's apartment was a double, not a king, and for 10 years, they had slept back to back, fighting for space. Now, the empty space on the left side of the mattress felt like a canyon. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The room was dark, the blinds drawn tight. The air was thick with it, her scent. It was everywhere. A blend of vanilla and expensive floral notes that clung to the sheets, the pillows, even the curtains. It was a smell that used to mean home, but now it smelled like a lie. James stood up abruptly. He couldn't breathe in here. He ripped the duvet off the bed, then the sheets. He pulled the pillowcases off with violent, jerky movements, throwing the fabric into a pile in the hallway. He stripped the mattress bare, leaving only the white protective cover exposed. It wasn't enough. He walked to the dresser and grabbed a bottle of rubbing alcohol he used for cleaning electronics. He marched into the bathroom, grabbed a rag, and came back. He began to wipe down the nightstand on her side of the bed. He scrubbed the wood until his knuckles turned white, erasing the rings left by her water glass, the dust where her jewelry box had sat. He worked with the same intensity he used on a rusted engine block. Scrub, wipe, erase. When he was done, the room smelled of isopropyl alcohol and old dust. The sweetness was gone. James looked at the bare mattress. It looked cold and uninviting, like a slab in a morgue. He walked out to the living room and collapsed onto the worn leather sofa. He pulled his heavy work jacket over himself as a blanket. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. A notification from Instagram. He shouldn't look, but his thumb moved automatically. It was a photo Isabella had just posted. A picture of a latte in a handleless cup, set against a blurred background of the Manhattan skyline. Caption, new views, new life. Finally breathing. James stared at the screen. The lie was so pretty. He turned the phone off and tossed it onto the floor. He closed his eyes, listening to the familiar, grounding sound of the neighbor's radiator clanking through the thin walls. He had work to do, and for the first time, he realized that the hardest repair job wasn't going to be the transmission on the lift. It was going to be learning how to sleep in a bed that was only made for one. The gallery in Chelsea was a cavern of white walls and hushed ambition. The air conditioning was set to a temperature that was just slightly too cold, designed to keep the patrons alert and the oil paint stable. Isabella moved through the crowd like a shark in a coral reef, her smile sharp and practiced. She wore a dress that was more structural architecture than clothing, a piece Matthew had picked out. It was uncomfortable, pinching at her waist, but she ignored the pain. Tonight was the opening of Matthew's solo exhibition, Deconstructed Egos, and it was her debut as his partner, in every sense of the word. She checked her phone again. 8:15 p.m. He should be here. She had told James to come to the gallery to sign the papers. She told herself it was about efficiency. Her lawyer was busy, and she didn't want to go back to Queens. But deep down, beneath the layers of rationalization, she knew the truth. She wanted him to see this. She wanted him to see the champagne towers, the buyers in their bespoke suits, the way she commanded the room. She wanted him to see what he had been holding her back from. The glass doors at the front of the gallery opened. The hum of conversation didn't stop, but it shifted. James walked in. He wasn't wearing his work jumpsuit. He was wearing a navy blue suit, the one they had bought for her cousin's wedding 3 years ago. It was a little tight in the shoulders now, straining against the muscle built from lifting engine blocks and turning wrenches. He had shaved, his jawline sharp and clean, and his dark hair was combed back. He didn't look like a mechanic. He looked like a man who had walked into the wrong movie but was refusing to leave the theater. Isabella felt a sudden, annoying spike of anxiety. He wasn't supposed to look dignified. He was supposed to look small. She excused herself from a conversation with a collector from Zurich and walked toward him. The click of her heels on the polished concrete was a declaration of authority. "You came," she said, stopping a safe 3 feet away from him. "You said it was urgent," James replied. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a massive canvas painted entirely in shades of angry black and bruised purple. He didn't look impressed. He looked confused. "Is this the art?" "It's abstract expressionism, James. It's about the void of modern existence." She didn't wait for his response. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded envelope. "The papers. I just need a signature on the last page. I have a notary over by the bar." James looked at the envelope, then back at her. "You couldn't mail this? You dragged me to Manhattan during rush hour for a signature?" "I thought you'd want to get it over with," she lied. Before James could answer, a hand clamped onto Isabella's shoulder. It was possessive, heavy. Matthew slid into the space between them, smelling of expensive gin and turpentine. "Isabella, darling, the critic from the Times is asking about the texture work on piece number 4, Matthew said, his eyes already sliding over to James. He paused, a smirk curling the corner of his mouth. "And who is this? A new collector? Or did we order extra security?" Isabella stiffened. "This is James, my ex-husband." Matthew's eyebrows shot up. He looked James up and down, not with jealousy, but with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a bug. "Oh, the mechanic, the man of the earth." James held Matthew's gaze. He didn't blink. He didn't shift his weight. He stood like a rock in a stream. "James," he said simply, not offering his hand. "Matthew." The artist replied, taking a sip of his wine. Bella tells me you're a wizard with American muscle cars. Very rustic. There's a certain honesty in manual labor, I suppose. It must be nice. Simple. You fix it, it works. No nuance required. The insult was wrapped in silk, but it cut just the same. Isabella waited for James to snap. She waited for him to raise his voice, to prove he didn't belong here. Instead, James just looked at Matthew's soft, manicured hands holding the wine glass. There's plenty of nuance, James said, his voice low and steady. If you don't respect the machine, it kills you. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. It just is. He turned his eyes to Isabella. Where do I sign? Isabella felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. The interaction wasn't going how she planned. James wasn't cowed. He was bored. She led him to the small table near the bar where the notary was waiting. James took the pen. He didn't read the terms. He didn't ask about the assets. He simply pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and signed his name in a clean, legible script. He capped the pen and handed it back to her. You're free, Bella, he said. He looked around the room once more, at the people laughing too loudly, at the stark white walls, at Matthew preening in the center of the crowd. I hope it's worth the price of admission. He turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. As the glass door closed behind him, cutting off the noise of the street, Isabella looked down at the signature. The ink was still wet. Well, Matthew said, appearing at her elbow again. That was painless. He's rather dense, isn't he? Like a block of wood. Isabella forced a laugh, but it sounded brittle in her own ears. She looked at the door where James had exited. For a second, the gallery didn't feel like a palace of culture. It felt like a sterile, white cage. And she was the one locked inside. The Tuesday rain in Queens didn't wash anything clean. It just made the grime slicker. James slid out from under the chassis of a 2012 Honda Civic, wiping a streak of oil from his cheek with the back of his hand. The shop was noisy. The rattle of pneumatic drills, the hiss of air compressors, the classic rock station playing low in the background. It was a symphony of labor, and for the last week, it was the only thing keeping James sane. Hey, boss. One of his younger mechanics, Leo, shouted from the front bay. You got a visitor, and you're going to want to see this. James frowned, tossing his rag onto the tool bench. He walked toward the front of the garage, expecting a parts delivery or an angry customer disputing a bill. Instead, he saw Silver. A flatbed tow truck was backing into the main bay, carrying a car that looked less like a vehicle and more like a piece of jewelry. It was a 1964 Aston Martin DB5, its silver birch paint gleaming under the fluorescent shop lights. It was beautiful, rare, and completely out of place next to the dented taxis and rusted sedans that usually filled the garage. A woman was standing next to the tow truck driver, signing a clipboard. She was wearing a trench coat that looked expensive, but her boots were sensible leather, splashed with mud. She didn't look like she was posing. She looked worried. James walked over, his eyes scanning the car before they even met hers. That's a hell of a risk, driving that on the line in this weather, he said. The woman turned. She had dark hair, pulled back loosely, and eyes that were sharp and intelligent. It wasn't a joyride. It was a transport to storage. Then it started making a sound like a dying cough, and then nothing. I'm James, he said, extending a hand before remembering the grease. He pulled it back. Sorry. Hands. I'm Sophia, she said, ignoring the grease and shaking his hand anyway. Her grip was firm. My father said you're the only person in the boroughs who actually knows how to tune a triple SU carburetor setup without ruining the linkage. James raised an eyebrow. Your father knows about SU carburetors? My father collects the cars, Sophia said, looking at the silver beast on the flatbed. I'm the one who drives them and fixes them, usually. But this is beyond me. I think it's the fuel pump, but the electrical system on these things is a nightmare. James felt a flicker of surprise. Isabella couldn't tell the difference between a spark plug and a tire iron, and she had never cared to learn. Here was a woman standing in a freezing garage, discussing fuel pumps. Let's get it down, James said to the driver. Once the car was on the concrete, James popped the hood. The engine bay was a work of art, complex, mechanical, honest. He leaned in, listening as Sophia turned the key. The engine sputtered, wheezed, and died. "Do it again," James commanded. He placed his hand on the intake manifold, feeling the vibration. "Okay, cut it." He straightened up, grabbing a rag to wipe his hands. "It's not the pump. The diaphragm is fine. It's the distributor points. They're corroded. You're not getting a clean spark." Sophia stepped closer, peering into the engine bay. She smelled like rain and old leather, not the overpowering floral perfume James was used to. "Are you sure? We had the ignition system redone 6 months ago." "I'm sure," James said. "Whoever did it used aftermarket parts, not OEM. The gap is off. The engine is choking itself." He looked at her. He expected her to argue, to pull rank, to tell him that her previous mechanic was a specialist in London. Instead, Sophia looked at him with genuine respect. "Can you fix it?" "I can," James said. "But I have to order the parts from a supplier I know in Connecticut. It'll take 3 days." Sophia let out a breath, her shoulders relaxing. 3 days is fine, as long as it's done right. This car, it was my grandfather's. It matters. "I'll treat it like my own," James promised. Sophia looked around the shop. She took in the stained concrete, the organized tool walls, the busy mechanics. She didn't look down her nose. She nodded, as if approving of the ecosystem. "You have a good shop here, James," she said. "It feels real." "It pays the bills," James said, deflecting. "No," she corrected him, her eyes meeting his again. "It does more than that. You keep things running. That's a rare skill these days. Everyone else just replaces things." The words hit James hard. Everyone else just replaces things. He thought of Isabella, replacing their marriage, replacing him, replacing her entire identity because she was bored. "Yeah," James said, his voice dropping an octave. "Some of us still believe in fixing things." Sophia held his gaze for a second too long, a moment of recognition passing between them. Then she pulled a business card from her coat pocket and placed it on the workbench. "Call me when the parts come in," she said. "I want to be here when you fire it up." James watched her walk out into the rain. She didn't run to a waiting limo. She opened an umbrella and walked toward the subway station down the block. He turned back to the Aston Martin. He ran his hand over the cold metal of the fender. For the first time since Isabella left, the silence in his head didn't feel lonely. It felt like focus. The dinner party at Matthew's penthouse was designed to look effortless, which meant it had taken 3 caterers and 6 hours to prepare. The table was set with porcelain that looked like shattered eggshells, and the guests were a carefully curated mix of critics, buyers, and fellow artists. The kind of people who spoke in paragraphs and laughed in lowercase. Isabella sat at the far end of the table, nursing her 3rd glass of Pinot Noir. She was wearing the black dress again, the one Matthew liked. She felt less like a hostess and more like a decorative vase that had been placed to fill a gap in the seating arrangement. The conversation had turned to a controversial new installation in Brooklyn, a pile of industrial waste spray-painted gold. Its derivative, a woman with severe red glasses announced, cutting into her steak. "It's trying too hard to comment on capitalism while simultaneously begging for a corporate sponsorship. It lacks teeth." "I don't know," Isabella chimed in, seeing an opening. She wanted to prove she belonged here, that she wasn't just the mechanic's ex-wife who had stumbled into high society. "I thought it was interesting. The way the gold caught the light, it made the garbage look beautiful. Maybe it's about finding value in what we throw away." The table went quiet. The silence wasn't thoughtful, it was awkward. Matthew set down his fork. He didn't look at Isabella with pride. He looked at her with a heavy, indulgent amusement, the way one looks at a child who has just said something foolishly adorable. "Oh, Bella," Matthew chuckled, the sound dry and hollow. "That's charmingly sentimental. But art isn't about making things pretty. That's interior design. That's what people do in Queens." A ripple of laughter went around the table. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. "Isabella has a very practical eye," Matthew continued, addressing the table while keeping his gaze on her. "She looks for the narrative, the happy ending. She struggles with the abstract because the abstract requires you to accept that there is no point. She still wants the car to start when she turns the key. The red-spectacled woman smirked. How quaint. Isabella felt the heat rise from her chest to her hairline. She forced a smile, freezing it onto her face. I suppose I do, she said, her voice tight. Don't pout, darling, Matthew said, raising his glass. Your literalism is grounding. It reminds us of how the other half sees the world. She took a sip of wine, swallowing the humiliation along with the expensive vintage. She wasn't a partner here. She was the punchline. Miles away, in the solitude of the garage, there was no laughter. There was only the rhythmic click-click-click of a ratchet. James was deep inside the engine bay of the Aston Martin. The shop was closed, the overhead doors locked tight against the night. He had been working for 4 hours straight, fueled by black coffee and a focus he hadn't felt in years. The distributor points on the DB5 were microscopic in their margin for error. If the gap was too wide, the spark would be weak. If it was too narrow, the points would burn out. It required a steady hand and an almost meditative patience. He held the feeler gauge between his thumb and forefinger, sliding it into the gap. It was tight, too tight. He adjusted the screw, a fraction of a millimeter. He checked again. Perfect. He didn't need an audience to tell him it was good. He didn't need a critic to deconstruct the meaning of the ignition timing. The validation was in the physics. Either it worked or it didn't. There was no lying in mechanics. He wiped his hands on a shop rag, admiring the clean lines of the engine. Sophia had been right. This car was special. It had a soul. And bringing it back to life felt like waking up something inside himself. He thought of Isabella then, just for a moment. He wondered if she was happy in her world of abstracts and theories. He wondered if she realized that you couldn't drive a painting and you couldn't live in a metaphor. James reached for the key in the ignition. He turned it. The engine cranked once, twice, and then roared to life. It wasn't the coughing sputter of before. It was a deep, throaty growl, smooth and powerful. The sound of a heart beating strong again. James leaned back against the fender, listening to the idle. It was the most beautiful sound he had heard in months. In the penthouse, Isabella laughed at a joke she didn't understand, feeling the hollowness in her chest expand. In the garage, James stood alone in the noise, finally feeling whole. The text message on Isabella's phone was from the gallery owner, asking her to pick up a contract from Matthew's home studio before the lunch rush. It was 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. The penthouse should have been empty. Matthew usually spent his mornings gathering inspiration at a coffee shop in the West Village. Isabella keyed the code into the private elevator. The doors slid open with a soft hush, revealing the sprawling living space. It was quiet, but the air felt charged, heavy with a scent she recognized but couldn't place immediately. It wasn't paint thinner. It was perfume, something heavy, musky, and definitely not hers. She walked toward the studio at the back of the loft. The frosted glass double doors were closed, but not latched. A sliver of light cut through the gap. Isabella didn't mean to sneak. She was his partner. She lived here. Yet, her footsteps on the concrete floor slowed, her body reacting to a danger her mind hadn't fully processed. She pushed the door open. The studio was bathed in the harsh northern light Matthew loved. In the center of the room, on the velvet chaise lounge he used for textural contrast, sat Chloe, a 22-year-old art student who had been interning at the gallery. She was wrapped in one of Matthew's silk shirts, her bare legs draped over the armrest. Matthew was standing at his easel, but he wasn't painting. He was sketching, his eyes locked on Chloe with a hunger that had nothing to do with art. Chloe laughed, a low, intimate sound. "You're terrible," she said, tilting her head back. Matthew stepped forward, dropping the charcoal. He placed a hand on her knee, his thumb tracing the skin. "I'm observant. There's a difference." Isabella felt the floor drop out from under her. It wasn't the sex. She hadn't walked in on the act itself. It was the intimacy. It was the way he looked at Chloe, with the same tragic muse adoration he had given Isabella 6 months ago. "Matthew," Isabella said. Her voice was thin, barely a whisper. They both looked up. Chloe didn't look ashamed. She looked annoyed, pulling the shirt tighter. Matthew didn't jump. He didn't scramble to cover up. He simply sighed, a sound of profound irritation, as if Isabella had interrupted a crucial phone call. Isabella, Matthew said, wiping his hands on a rag. I thought you were at the gallery. I came for the contracts, she stammered, pointing vaguely at the desk. Matthew, what is this? It's a study, he said calmly, walking over to the desk to shuffle some papers. Chloe has a skeletal structure that captures the light in a way I need for the new series. We're working. Working. Isabella's voice rose, trembling. She's wearing your shirt. You were touching her. Matthew stopped. He turned to face her, his expression hardening into that familiar look of bored superiority. Oh, please. Don't start this. Start what? Fidelity? Isabella snapped, the shock turning into a hot, blinding rage. We are together, Matthew. You asked me to move in. You told me I was your partner. Partner, yes. Jailer, no. Matthew countered, his voice dripping with ice. He walked closer, invading her personal space not with affection, but with intimidation. Isabella, look at you. You're shaking. You're red in the face. You're acting so provincial. The word hit her like a slap. Provincial. Small town. Queens. I'm acting like a person who expects respect, she said, though her conviction was wavering under his stare. You're acting like a suburban housewife who thinks she owns her husband, Matthew sneered. This isn't Queens, Isabella. We don't subscribe to those archaic, possessive little rules here. I am an artist. I need flow. I need connection. If I sleep with Chloe, which I haven't yet, though the energy is certainly there, it doesn't subtract from you. Unless you make it about you. He gestured to the door. If you can't handle the complexity of a life lived without boundaries, maybe you should go back to your mechanic. I'm sure he's exactly where you left him, fixing his little cars and waiting for dinner at 6 o'clock sharp. Isabella looked at Chloe, who was now checking her phone, completely unbothered. She looked at Matthew, who was looking at her with disdain. She realized then that she hadn't escaped the trap of a boring marriage. She had walked into a trap of emotional sadism. James had never looked at another woman. James had never made her feel small for wanting loyalty. James would have cut off his own hand before he disrespected her like this. I'm not provincial, Isabella whispered, fighting back tears. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of crying. Then stop acting like it, Matthew said, turning his back on her to pick up his charcoal. Take the contracts. And close the door on your way out. You're letting the draft in. Isabella grabbed the folder from the desk. Her hands were numb. She walked out of the studio, the sound of Chloe's giggle following her like a ghost. She reached the elevator and pressed the button, leaning her forehead against the cool metal wall. She was surrounded by millions of dollars of art, living in a penthouse in the greatest city in the world. And she had never felt more like trash. The issue of the New York Times Style magazine landed on the glass desk of the gallery reception with a heavy thud. Isabella was standing nearby, sorting through invites for an upcoming sculpture retrospective. Her head was pounding. Since the incident in the studio 3 days ago, the air in the penthouse had been toxic. Matthew had stopped speaking to her, treating her with a polite, icy distance that was worse than screaming. He spent his nights, working late, and Isabella spent hers staring at the ceiling, wondering when the eviction notice would come. Have you seen this, Bella? The receptionist, a sharp-eyed girl named Chloe, a cruel coincidence of naming that Isabella hated, asked. It's the maker's issue. There's a spread on that vintage Aston Martin restoration everyone is talking about. The car belongs to the Rossi shipping family. Isabella felt a vague flicker of interest. The Rossi family was old money, the kind of clients the gallery was desperate to court. Let me see. She pulled the magazine toward her. The cover featured a famous architect, but Chloe flipped it open to page 42. Isabella's breath hitched in her throat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was a 2-page spread. On the left was the car, the silver 1964 Aston Martin DB5, gleaming, perfect, a machine of pure elegance. But on the right page, taking up the full frame, was a black and white portrait of a man. It was James. But it wasn't the James she had left in the kitchen 3 weeks ago. The photographer had captured him in the middle of his work. He was wearing a white t-shirt stained with oil and grease, his forearms flexed as he leaned over a workbench. The lighting was dramatic, highlighting the sharp angle of his jaw, the intensity of his dark eyes, and the quiet, rugged capability of his hands. He didn't look tired. He looked powerful. He looked like the embodiment of something lost and precious. The headline read, "The Alchemist of Queens, Restoring the Soul of the Machine." Isabella's hands trembled as she read the text. In an era of planned obsolescence, James Caluso is a relic. He doesn't just fix cars, he resurrects history. You have to listen to the metal, Caluso says. It tells you where it hurts. Most people stop listening when things get broken. I don't. The article went on to describe his shop not as a failing garage, but as a temple of authenticity. It mentioned his monastic dedication and his uncompromising standards. Then came the paragraph that made Isabella's stomach turn over. The project was commissioned by Sophia Rossi, heiress to the Rossi Maritime Empire, who discovered Caluso's shop by accident. "I brought him a wreck," Rossi says. "He gave me back a masterpiece. James sees beauty where others see burden." Sophia Rossi. The name was printed in bold. A woman worth hundreds of millions of dollars was quoting James as if he were a philosopher. Isabella looked up from the page, feeling dizzy. For years, she had looked at James and seen only limitations. She saw the grease under his nails as a sign of failure. She saw his quietness as a lack of ambition. Now, the New York Times was telling the world that those exact traits were what made him exceptional. "He's hot," the receptionist noted, chewing on the end of a pen. "Like, really hot. In a Marlon Brando way. Do we know him?" Isabella swallowed hard. I used to." "Lucky you." The girl laughed, turning back to her computer. Isabella grabbed the magazine and walked briskly to her small office at the back of the gallery. She closed the door and sat down, staring at the photo again. She touched the glossy paper, tracing the line of James's shoulder. She looked at her phone. Her last text to Matthew, "Are we having dinner tonight?" remained unread after 4 hours. She looked back at James. In the photo, he looked complete. He didn't look like he was missing her. In fact, the article didn't mention a wife. It didn't mention a past. It presented him as a solitary, stoic hero. A knock on her door made her jump. It was Matthew. He strolled in, looking disheveled and smelling of cigarettes. He saw the magazine open on her desk. "Oh, looking at the competition?" he sneered lightly, though he didn't really look at the page. "I heard the Rossi girl is making a play for the classic car circuit. Buying up junk." "It's not junk," Isabella said, her voice surprisingly steady. She turned the magazine around so he could see. "It's James." Matthew blinked. He leaned in, squinting at the photo. The smirk faded from his lips, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. He read the headline. He looked at the photo of James, the raw, undeniable masculinity of it. Then he looked at his own reflection in the darkened window of the office, slender, soft, curated. "Well," Matthew said, straightening up and adjusting his scarf. "Even a broken clock is right twice a day." They love a blue-collar savior narrative this season. It's poverty porn. It won't last. "He looks happy," Isabella whispered. "He looks dirty," Matthew corrected. "Come on. I need you to book a table at Le Cuckoo. Chloe is joining us for a strategy meeting." He walked out, assuming she would follow orders. Isabella sat there for a long time. She looked at James's eyes in the photo. James sees beauty where others see burden. She realized with a crushing weight that she had been the burden. And now that she was gone, he was flying. The silence in the penthouse was different tonight. It wasn't the contemplative silence of an art gallery. It was the suffocating silence of a vacuum. Matthew had gone out 3 hours ago, muttering something about a late install in Brooklyn, but he hadn't taken his tool bag. He had taken his cologne. Isabella sat on the edge of the sprawling white sofa, the light from her phone illuminating her face in a ghostly blue. On the screen, the contact name James stared back at her. She hadn't called him since the day she left. They had communicated only through lawyers and the brief, icy exchange at the gallery. She told herself she needed to call. It was practical. It was necessary. It was about the mail. Yes, the mail. It was tax season, and surely some forms had gone to the Queen's address. It was a valid reason. But as her thumb hovered over the call button, she knew it was a lie. She wanted to hear a voice that didn't sound like it was judging her. She wanted to hear the steady, predictable cadence of the man she had discarded. She wanted to know if the man in the New York Times photo still sounded like her husband. She pressed call. The ringing sound was loud in the empty room. 1 ring. 2. 3. He wasn't going to answer. He was probably under a car, or sleeping, or hello. The voice was clear. There was no background noise of an impact wrench or a TV. Just a low, ambient hum of conversation and the clink of silverware. Isabella's breath hitched. James? It's me. There was a pause. A hesitation that hurt more than anger. I know, Isabella. Is everything okay? Is it an emergency? No emergency, she said quickly, trying to pitch her voice to sound breezy, unbothered. I realized I haven't received my W-2s from the old consulting gig. I thought they might have been sent to the apartment. I didn't want you to throw them out. I didn't throw them out, James said. His tone was polite but clipped. I put everything that came for you in a box. I gave it to your lawyer last week. He didn't tell you? Oh, Isabella said. She felt foolish. He must have forgotten. You know how lawyers are. Right, James said. Was there anything else? He was rushing her. James, who used to listen to her complain about her boss for hours while he rubbed her feet, was rushing her. I saw the article, she blurted out. The Times. You looked good, James. Really good. I didn't know you were working on a project like that. It came in after you left, he said simply. It's been a busy month. I bet, she said. She gripped the phone tighter. James, I was thinking maybe we could grab coffee, just to sort out the final details. The lease transfer, the utility bills. It might be easier than going through the attorneys. In the background on James's end, a woman's voice drifted through the receiver. It was warm, melodic, and laughing. James, you have to try the risotto. It's incredible, the voice said. Isabella froze. She recognized the tone. It wasn't a waitress. It was the voice of someone sitting across the table, someone comfortable, someone sharing a meal. Who is that? Isabella whispered. Isabella, I'm at dinner, James said, ignoring her question. His voice dropped, becoming firm. I can't do this right now. The lawyers have the paperwork. Let's keep it professional. It's cleaner that way. But I have to go, James said. Good night, Bella. The line clicked. Then, the dial tone. Isabella lowered the phone slowly. She stared at the black screen. He hadn't asked how she was. He hadn't asked about Matthew. He hadn't lingered. He was having dinner with someone else, someone who made him laugh, someone who was currently sharing a bottle of wine and a plate of risotto with him, while Isabella sat in a $3 million penthouse eating crackers for dinner. The humiliation washed over her, hot and prickling. She had thought she was the protagonist of this story, the one who drove the plot. She thought James was just the background character waiting in the wings for her to return or deign to notice him. She stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city lights of Manhattan sprawled out before her, a grid of electricity and ambition. But looking at it now, it didn't look like opportunity. It looked like a cold, indifferent machine. Across the river, in a warm Italian trattoria in Astoria, James set his phone down on the table, screen side down. Everything okay? Sophia asked, pausing with her fork halfway to her mouth. Her eyes were concerned, but not prying. James looked at her. He looked at the candlelight reflecting in her dark eyes, the genuine warmth of her expression. He thought of the cold, empty tone in Isabella's voice, the desperation he had heard creeping around the edges of her words. He picked up his wine glass. Yeah, James said, smiling for the first time that evening. Everything is fine. Just a wrong number. The rain had returned to Manhattan, a gray, relentless drizzle that streaked the windows of the penthouse, making the city outside look like a dissolving watercolor painting. Inside, the temperature was perfectly controlled, but Isabella felt a chill that went straight to her marrow. She walked into the living room, carrying her morning coffee. She had barely slept after the phone call with James. His voice, distant, polite, and undeniably happy, had looped in her mind all night. Matthew was already awake. He was standing by the window, staring out, his hands clasped behind his back. There were boxes on the floor. 3 of them. Cardboard, generic, taped shut. Isabella frowned, setting her cup down on a coaster. Are you shipping pieces to the gallery in Berlin? She asked, trying to sound normal, trying to bridge the gap that had widened between them all week. Matthew turned slowly. He didn't smile. His face was a mask of bored pity, the same expression he wore when rejecting a portfolio from an amateur student. No, Matthew said smoothly. Those aren't mine, Bella. They're yours. Isabella stopped. The room seemed to tilt. I don't understand. It's the energy, Matthew sighed, walking over to the sofa and sitting down, crossing his legs elegantly. I've been meditating on it. The flow in here, it's been stagnant since you moved in. My creative chakra is blocked. I need a reset. A tabula rasa. A reset. Isabella repeated, the words feeling heavy and foreign in her mouth. Matthew, I live here. We're together. We were experimenting, he corrected, picking up a magazine and idly flipping through it. And the experiment has yielded its results. We're not compatible, darling. You're too anchored. You want security. You want definition. It's exhausting. It's stifling my process. Stifling your process? Isabella's voice rose, cracking with incredulity. I organize your life. I manage your schedule. I cooked for your investors last week while you sat there and drank 3 bottles of wine. I left my husband for this. Matthew looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. And that was your choice. Don't put that burden on me. I never asked you to blow up your life. I just offered you a key. Now, I'm asking for it back. He gestured to the boxes. I had the maid pack your books and your toiletries. The rest of your clothes are still in the closet. I need the space cleared by noon on Saturday. Chloe is moving her sculpting equipment in. She needs the northern light. Chloe, of course. You're kicking me out for a 22-year-old? Isabella whispered. I'm reclaiming my space for art, Matthew said, standing up. He checked his vintage Rolex. I have a brunch meeting in the village. You can handle the packing? Do you need me to call you a car service? The casual cruelty of it took her breath away. He wasn't even angry. He was just done. She was a leased object, and the lease was up. Where am I supposed to go? She asked, her voice trembling. I gave up my apartment. I have nowhere. Matthew shrugged, adjusting his scarf in the hallway mirror. You're a resourceful woman, Isabella. You'll figure it out. Stay at a hotel. Go back to Queens. Just don't be here when I get back on Saturday. I hate goodbyes. They're so melodramatic. He walked to the door, opened it, and paused. Oh, and leave the key on the counter. The spare one, too. The door clicked shut. Isabella stood alone in the vast, beautiful, silent room. The boxes on the floor mocked her. She thought of the night she left James. She remembered how she had stood in the kitchen, feeling superior, feeling like she was ascending to a higher plane of existence. She remembered James's quiet dignity, the way he had let her go without a fight because he respected her choice, even if it broke him. She looked at the white walls of the penthouse. This wasn't a home. It was a showroom, and she had just been taken off display. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. She had no lease. She had depleted her savings buying clothes to fit into Matthew's world. She had alienated her friends. She had discarded her husband. She walked over to the window and looked down at the street. People were rushing by, tiny dots in the rain. Somewhere out there, in the grid of the city, James was working. He had a roof over his head. He had a business. He had a life that was real. Isabella sank onto the floor next to the cardboard boxes. She pulled her knees to her chest. She didn't cry. She was too hollow to cry. She just sat there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, realizing that for the first time in her life, she was truly, completely homeless. The yellow taxi rattled over the potholes of Queens Boulevard, the suspension groaning with every impact. Isabella sat in the back, clutching her designer purse like a shield. In the trunk were 2 suitcases, the sum total of her life in Manhattan. She had told the driver the address of the garage, not the apartment. She knew James would be there. It was Saturday afternoon. He was always there. In her mind, she had already scripted the scene. She would walk in, looking fragile and beautifully tragic in the rain. She would tell him that the city was too cold, too shallow, and that she realized she missed the authenticity of their life. She wouldn't apologize, not explicitly. She would frame her return as a mercy, a second chance she was graciously granting him. He would be angry at first, surely, but then he would see her, and the anger would melt. He always melted. He was James. He was the constant. "This it, lady," the driver grunted, pulling over to the curb. Isabella looked out the window. For a second, she thought they were at the wrong address. The faded, peeling sign that used to read Caluso Auto Repair was gone. In its place was a sleek, hand-painted sign in matte black and silver, Caluso Restoration and Engineering. The grease-stained windows had been cleaned. The pile of junk tires by the bay door was gone, replaced by two large planter boxes filled with hardy, rain-slicked ferns. "Yes," she whispered. "This is it." She paid the driver and stepped out into the drizzle. The taxi sped off, splashing a puddle of dirty water onto the hem of her trench coat. She didn't flinch. She just stared at the shop. The bay doors were rolled down, keeping the cold out, but the pedestrian door was glass. Warm, golden light spilled out onto the wet sidewalk. It looked inviting. It looked like a hearth. Isabella dragged her suitcase toward the door. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She rehearsed her opening line. "James, I'm home." She reached for the handle, but her hand froze inches from the metal. Through the glass, she saw them. James was leaning against the main workbench, the one he used to keep cluttered with receipts and old coffee cups. Now it was organized. He was wearing a clean gray thermal shirt, his arms crossed over his chest, his head thrown back in laughter. It was a full, open laugh, the kind that crinkles the eyes. Isabella hadn't seen him laugh like that in 5 years. And he wasn't laughing alone. Sitting on the high stool across from him was the woman from the magazine article. Sophia. She wasn't wearing a ball gown or a power suit. She was wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair tied up in a messy bun. She was holding a slice of pizza, gesturing with it as she spoke, her face animated and bright. There was a bottle of red wine on the bench between them. Cheap wine, served in simple tumblers, not crystal stemware. But the way they looked at each other made the space feel more luxurious than Matthew's penthouse. Isabella watched as Sophia reached out and wiped a smudge of grease from James's cheek with her thumb. It was a casual, instinctive gesture. James didn't pull away. He didn't look embarrassed. He leaned into her touch, just slightly, his eyes softening. It wasn't the look of a man who was mourning a marriage. It was the look of a man who was discovering something new. Isabella felt a physical blow to her chest, harder than any insult Matthew had ever thrown at her. She had expected to find a shrine to her memory. She had expected to find a man paralyzed by her absence. Instead, she found a man who had healed. She looked at her reflection in the glass of the door, wet hair, smeared mascara, standing in the rain with her luggage like a refugee from a life she had destroyed. Then she looked through the glass at the warmth inside. She realized with a terrifying clarity that she couldn't open the door. The key she had left on the kitchen table didn't just lock the apartment. It had locked the chapter. Inside, James said something else, and Sophia smiled, a radiant, genuine smile that lit up the garage. Isabella's hand dropped to her side. She took a step back. Then another. The rain fell harder, soaking through her coat, chilling her to the bone. She gripped the handle of her suitcase, the plastic digging into her palm. She turned away from the light. She began to walk down the street toward the subway station, the wheels of her suitcase rattling loudly on the uneven pavement, a lonely sound that no one inside the shop could hear. The Monday morning sky was a bruised purple, clearing slowly after the weekend's rain. The air in Queens smelled of wet asphalt and freshly brewed coffee. James was rolling up the metal bay doors of the shop, the chain rattling in a familiar, steady rhythm. He locked the chain in place and turned around. She was standing there. Isabella stood on the sidewalk, near the curb where the trash cans used to be. She was wearing jeans and a simple gray sweater, clothes he remembered from years ago, before the gallery, before the galas, before Matthew. Her hair was loose, blowing slightly in the wind. She looked tired. The sharp, polished angles of the woman who had left him were gone, replaced by a softness that looked a lot like defeat. James wiped his hands on a rag, though they were already clean. He didn't smile, But he didn't frown either. He just waited. Isabella took a step forward, stopping at the threshold of the garage. She didn't cross the line where the sunlight hit the concrete. "I saw the sign," she said quietly. Her voice was hoarse. "It looks different." "It is different," James said. He leaned against the frame of the door, keeping a respectful distance. "We renovated last month. Business is good." "I saw the article too," she added. She looked down at her shoes, then back up at him. Her eyes were swimming with tears she was fighting to hold back. "You were right, James. About everything. About the engine. About the broken parts. About me." James sighed, a soft sound that was carried away by the wind. "Isabella, don't." "I have to," she insisted, taking another step. "I made a mistake. A terrible, arrogant mistake. I thought I wanted a life that was bigger, but it wasn't bigger. It was just hollow. I walked away from the only real thing I ever had." She reached out a hand, palm up, a gesture of pleading. "I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve it. But you fix things, James. That's what you do. You take things that are wrecked and you make them run again. Can't we fix this?" James looked at her hand. He looked at the wedding band tan line that had almost faded from his own finger. He felt a pang of memory. 10 years of history, of shared meals, of struggle. But when he looked at her now, he didn't feel the pull of a magnet. He felt the distance of a stranger. He shook his head slowly. "There's a rule in mechanics, Bella," James said gently. "Metal has a memory. Once you bend a frame past a certain point, the structure is compromised. You can hammer it out, you can paint over it, you can make it look perfect. But the first time it hits a bump, it will snap. It's never as strong as it was before." "We aren't metal," Isabella whispered, a tear finally escaping. "No," James agreed. "We're more fragile. You didn't just leave, Bella. You looked at me and decided I wasn't enough. You can't undo that, and I can't unknow it." He turned and walked toward the small office at the back of the shop. Isabella watched him, her heart sinking. He returned a moment later, holding a key ring. It was the key to the 2012 Honda Civic she had left behind. He walked over and pressed the keys into her palm. His hand was warm, rough, and steady. "The Honda is parked around the back," he said. "I tuned it up for you. Replaced the oil, rotated the tires. It's got a full tank of gas. It'll get you wherever you need to go." Isabella closed her fingers around the cold metal of the keys. It was a kindness, she realized. And that was the final nail in the coffin. If he had screamed at her, there might have been passion left. If he had hated her, there might have been a connection. But this kindness? This was the charity one gives to a guest. "You're happy," she said. It wasn't a question. James looked over his shoulder toward the office, where Sophia's coat was hanging on the rack. He looked back at Isabella, his eyes clear and calm. "I am," he said. "I finally am." Isabella nodded. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater. She took a deep breath, straightening her spine. There was nothing left to say. The transaction was complete. "Goodbye, James," she said softly. "Take care of yourself, Isabella," he replied. She turned and walked toward the alley where the car was parked. James didn't watch her go. He turned back to the shop floor. The silver Aston Martin was waiting on the lift, ready for its final inspection. He walked over to the car, running his hand along the fender. The metal was cool and solid. From the back alley, he heard the sound of the Honda's engine turning over. It started on the first try, smooth, reliable, fixed. He heard the tires crunch on the gravel, the sound fading as the car merged into the morning traffic of Queens. James picked up his wrench. The sun was fully up now, flooding the garage with light. He had work to do.